At 5:13 a.m., the hills west of Austin were still drenched in darkness, the kind of darkness that swallows sound and makes entire neighborhoods feel abandoned. Then the quiet fractured. A column of black SUVs glided through the iron gates of an $8 million mansion, as if carried by the fog itself. No headlights, no sirens, no warnings. The teams inside those vehicles weren't responding to a call. They were executing the final phase of a years-long hunt for one man. Alexei Tsvetkov, known across Eastern Europe and the American Southwest by a single mocking nickname. Pellman, a name whispered by trafficked migrants. A name scratched into the margins of seized ledgers. A name analysts trace through encrypted chats, Balkan arms manifests, and cartel payrolls. To the residents of the gated community, he was just that quiet Ukrainian with the perfect lawn. To law enforcement, he was the architect of one of the most disciplined criminal syndicates to ever set foot in the United States, running weapons south, narcotics north, and human cargo in both directions. The mansion did not look like a criminal fortress. It looked like a lifestyle advertisement. Imported stone columns, lake views, a driveway polished to a mirror sheen. For nearly a decade, Tsvetkov used this place as camouflage, blending in with the wealthy retirees and tech executives who assumed he was simply another immigrant entrepreneur with accent, etiquette, and money. They were right about the money. Everything else was a lie. The breach team approached the front doors with surgical precision. A drone hovered overhead, its thermal feed piping into helmet displays. The mansion glowed with false life. Preset lighting, climate control cycles, security loops programmed to mimic movement. A synthetic house belonging to a synthetic man. The signal came. A dull, metallic thud shook the doorframe. The lock surrendered. The agents flowed inside like a single organism, each movement rehearsed 100 times in training. The foyer sparkled under their beams. Marble floors, glass sculptures, fresh-cut orchids flown in weekly from Miami. Everything inside the mansion was curated to look effortless. The first cracks in the illusion appeared almost immediately. A bookshelf on the eastern wall sat a fraction of an inch too far forward. A pressure seam lined its edge. A gloved hand made contact. The panel clicked, once, like the heartbeat of the house, and the bookcase swung open, revealing a descending concrete passage. The temperature dropped with each step. Air shifted. Silence thickened. At the bottom, the walls were no longer stone but reinforced steel. The floor no longer marble but industrial epoxy. The smell no longer floral but chemical. Oil, metal, solvents. The unmistakable scent of large-scale trafficking operations. Lights snapped on automatically, revealing the true home of Alexei Pellman Tsvetkov. The first chamber was arranged with military perfection. Crates stenciled in Cyrillic and English, ammunition drums stacked waist-high, precision rifle kits custom-built in Eastern Europe, night vision modules still in protective foam, industrial presses used for narcotics packaging, rows of vacuum-sealed bricks, methamphetamine, fentanyl, analog stimulants, sorted by state destination. This was not a stash room. This was a factory. In the next section, servers hummed inside climate-controlled racks. Tactical software projected distribution routes across the U.S., like arteries pulsing across a digital body. Texas was the heart. Branch lines stretched to Denver, Cincinnati, Phoenix, Atlanta. Every shipment route timed. Every return load accounted for. Everything optimized, automated, redundant. This was the design signature of a man who came out of post-Soviet smuggling corridors, where survival required engineering, not luck. Farther in, a locked compartment contained human trafficking manifests, written in a tight, meticulous hand. Passport photos of missing migrants, payment codes, routes, pickup nodes, drop locations. Cold data arranged without emotion. The kind of records kept by someone who never expected the system to fail. Beyond that, forged passports, shell company registrations, bank tokens, crypto hardware wallets, cash duffel bags, and names, hundreds of names, belonging to the invisible workforce Tsvetkov used to keep the machine running. By the time agents reached the third sub-basement, an unmistakable truth emerged. Alexei Pellman Tsvetkov did not run a criminal operation. He ran a system a self-sustaining, multi-layered, structurally redundant organism built to outlive its creator. Upstairs, the mansion's windows were just beginning to catch the first pale streaks of dawn. Down here, under the stone and steel, federal agents stood inside something far larger than one man's empire. This was the first rupture, the first crack in a network that had moved silently for years under the country's nose, hidden not in shadows, but in plain sight, in a mansion with a view, behind smiling neighbors who never once wondered why their quiet Ukrainian neighbor kept adding new rooms beneath his home. The danger hadn't slipped into Texas. It had purchased a house, mowed its lawn, blended in, and waited for the nation to stop paying attention. The deeper the agents moved beneath Alexei Pelmin-Svetkov's mansion, the more obvious it became that the luxury above ground was nothing but a shell, a costume worn by a predator who spent a decade convincing Texas he was harmless. Down here, beneath layers of concrete and steel, was the real Alexei. Not the polite immigrant with a soft accent, not the quiet neighbor who waved from his garden, but the architect of a criminal engine so disciplined, so perfectly reinforced, that even federal analysts would later admit the same unsettling truth. This place was not built to hide crime. It was built to execute it. The second sublevel opened into a corridor long enough to disappear into shadow. Every 20 feet, ventilation shafts hummed with filtered air. Every 10 feet, cameras adjusted automatically as agents passed, tracking movement with mechanical precision. This was not amateur construction. These were systems designed by someone who understood both smuggling and survival. Someone who had lived through the collapse of states, the fragmentation of borders, and the rise of private militias. Someone who learned long ago that the safest empire is the one no one knows exists. The first secure room on this level looked like an armory designed for an army. Racks of weapons lined the walls, imported assault rifles with custom receivers, compact machine pistols built for urban smuggling routes, long-range precision rifles fitted with European optics. Many carried markings scraped off with acid. Others bore serial numbers linked to seizures in Moldova, Transnistria, and Odessa, evidence of a man who'd been walking through conflict zones long before he reached American soil. Each weapon was tagged with route markers, some destined for Mexico, others scheduled for discreet sales in Arizona or New Mexico. Some marked only with 3 letters federal analysts would later identify as human trafficking guard units, armed escorts responsible for protecting smuggled migrants during high-risk transit zones. The room radiated a cold clarity. Nothing here was emotional, nothing expressionistic. Everything had a purpose, a route, a destination. It was logistics wearing the skin of violence. In the adjacent chamber, the tone shifted. This was not an armory. This was an assembly floor. Industrial-grade drug presses sat in bolted frames, surrounded by stacks of raw chemical compounds. Ventilation lines fed into scrubber units, engineered to erase scent and particulate trace. Bags of precursor powders sat in labeled bins. Each bin carried a timestamp, a source code, and a yield projection. This was not where drugs were stored. This was where they were made. The agents who stepped inside paused, not from fear, but from the sheer scale. No cartel in the Southwest operated with this level of cleanliness. No independent group had this degree of discipline. No loose criminal ring could maintain industrial consistency across thousands of miles of transport corridors. Every corner of this workspace radiated the mindset of a man who built systems, not risks, who built redundancy, not chances. This was the signature of Alexei Tsvetkov, the man whose nickname Pelmin, once used as a joke among Eastern European traffickers, had become the stamp of a network designed to operate like a machine. A metallic slide door led to the most disturbing room yet. Inside, temperature-controlled lockers held thick binders, the kind used in disaster response centers or intelligence war rooms. The pages inside didn't record drug weights or arms inventories. They recorded people, rows of photographs, identification numbers, transit codes, drop points, exchange fees, assignment notes. Not cartel chaos, not gang scrawls, but a bureaucratic archive of human beings moved like shipments. For every victim smuggled into the country, a coded entry tracked them. For every disappearance, a notation. For every transfer, a timestamp. No aliases, no nicknames, no emotion. It was a database written by someone who saw human cargo as the most profitable commodity because it provided two revenues at once: the payment to enter and the payment to remain hidden. Analysts would later call this room the coldest place in Texas, not because of the temperature, but because of the method. This was not brutality out of control. This was brutality measured, structured, monetized. A third chamber revealed something different: a treasury. Not cash alone, though stacks of vacuum-sealed bundles lined the shelves, but the backbone of a financial architecture. Crypto hardware wallets organized in labeled trays, international bank access tokens stored in climate-controlled cases, ledger notebooks filled with coded entries mapping money flows across Hong Kong, Cyprus, Vancouver, and Buenos Aires. Each symbol corresponded to a division. Each curve or dash carried meaning. Over years, Svetkov built a system so compartmentalized that even if 10 layers collapsed, the core would continue running. This was not confidence, it was redundancy, his greatest weapon. But the fourth chamber exposed a truth none of the agents expected. Mounted on the wall were blueprints, architectural sketches, infrastructure maps, roadway access diagrams, air cargo schematics. Not random selection. Every document linked to warehouses, ports, trucking depots, and private airports across multiple states. Red lines traced routes. Green lines marked backups. Yellow lines marked emergency diversions. This was not a man reacting to opportunity. This was a man engineering inevitability. And at the center of every map was a single, handwritten symbol federal analysts would later identify as Svetkov's personal marker. A symbol he'd used since his earliest days in Eastern Europe, when he first learned that survival meant one thing: build something too complex to kill. Agents moved deeper until they reached the last chamber. Silent, cold, reinforced with steel plates bolted into the concrete. Here, inside a vault designed to withstand fire, assault, and breaching charges, they found what tied everything together: a command desk, 3 monitors still glowing, a map of North America pulsing with active nodes, shipment cycles, driver schedules, cross-border coordination pings, trafficking alerts, weapon transfer chains. The mansion wasn't a home. It was the headquarters of a multinational criminal organism, with its brain buried underground. And Alexei Pelman Svetkov wasn't a fugitive. He was a system builder, a man who didn't trust countries, laws, or borders, only the reliability of the machines he built from the shadows. Upstairs, morning light had finally begun to touch the stone facade of the mansion. But down here, beneath luxury and lies, the agent stood inside the operational skeleton of a syndicate designed not simply to survive, but to expand. This wasn't the end of the investigation. This was the blueprint of an empire that had lived undetected for years, thriving under the assumption that no one would ever dig deep enough to find the truth. They had found it. Now the real war would begin. By the time the sun cleared the horizon over Austin, the raid on Alexei Pelman Svetkov's mansion had already triggered the next phase of the federal operation. The intelligence recovered from the underground vault did not describe a syndicate, it diagrammed one. The entire structure of his empire lay mapped across digital monitors, in lines, nodes, weight codes, and color-coded redundancy paths. It was the closest thing law enforcement had ever gotten to a full blueprint of an international criminal machine built by a single man. The mansion was just the nerve center. The real body was scattered across the Southwest. At 4:52 a.m., inside a mobile command trailer parked beside a San Antonio field office, a dozen federal analysts watched the data scroll across their screens in real time. Each red node represented a trafficking hub. Each green line represented a route. Each flashing marker showed active movement. The screen pulsed with irregular rhythms, like a diseased heartbeat. The operation launched the moment confirmation came through. Svetkov had gone dark, his phones dead, his safe houses empty, his digital footprints flatlined. It didn't mean he was gone. It meant he was evacuating, or activating fail-safes. The order was immediate. Phase 2, Iron Meridian. Helicopters lifted off from 3 locations simultaneously. Rotors sending gravel and dust spiraling into the cold dawn. Armored SUVs rolled onto interstate ramps without sirens or lights. Convoys of tactical trucks blended into early commuter traffic, indistinguishable from utility crews or delivery fleets. Every movement was silent. Every second mattered. The first target was a warehouse on the eastern edge of El Paso. To the untrained eye, it looked like an agricultural storage site. Rows of fertilizer pallets, metal barns, a faded company sign weathered by sun and dust. But the data from Svetkov's servers told a different story. The warehouse was a funnel point, one of 3 primary redistribution hubs that fed his narcotics routes into New Mexico, Arizona, and the interior of Texas. The breach charge hit the side door at 6:03 a.m. The dust hadn't finished rising before the gunfire started. It came fast, controlled, and precise. Too precise for random street muscle. These weren't panicked traffickers scrambling behind pallets. They were trained. Eastern European accents had been heard at this site before. Now, their presence was unmistakable. They moved with the rigid, drilled discipline of men who had survived wars, collapsed states, and the brutality of paramilitary environments. Tactical beams flickered across metal shelving as agents pushed forward. Shell casings clattered against concrete. Sparks snapped from ricocheting rounds. A forklift toppled, smashing into a crate of fertilizer bags that burst like chalk clouds. The firefight lasted 2 minutes and 41 seconds, though to the men inside it stretched into an eternity of noise, heat, and adrenaline. When the gunfire stopped, 7 enforcers were down. 3 neutralized, 4 restrained. Their gear told a story of its own. Custom armor plates, modified AK variants, encrypted radios on Eastern European channels. They weren't here to protect product. They were here to die in place if necessary. That alone revealed the scale of the network Svetkov had built. Behind a false wall, agents found what mattered most. Long-haul trucks fitted with double interior panels, radiation-shielded compartments, and thermal masking insulation. Each vehicle was engineered to defeat X-ray and heat scanners at border checkpoints. One truck carried crates labeled as agricultural machinery. Another carried sealed drums of cleaning chemicals. Another held what looked like household goods arranged neatly, until the thermal wand lit the interior bright white. This was not smuggling. This was supply chain engineering. While the El Paso site was secured, a second strike unfolded in Laredo. The target? Vector Line Freight, a seemingly legitimate shipping company registered as a mid-tier logistics provider. The office looked ordinary, framed certificates on the walls, a coffee machine still warm, paperwork stacked in neat trays. But the employees inside avoided eye contact, hands trembling. They weren't fighters, they weren't soldiers, they were participants in a system they thought was real. The agents seized ledgers, burner phones, encrypted tablets, and a shipment log that mapped deliveries to 39 states. Every route originated in Texas. Every shipment looked legal. Every document passed inspections. The illusion was perfect. The arrests grew in waves. Drivers, dock supervisors, warehouse clerks, independent brokers. Many protested, genuinely unaware they'd been working inside a criminal skeleton disguised as a logistics business. They had scanned packages, signed forms, filed reports, and never once suspected the loads they handled were built to bypass detection protocols. But the real shock came from the paperwork itself. Everything was immaculate. No forged signatures, no missing documents, no sloppy mistakes. It didn't look like crime, it looked like government efficiency. As the morning bled into afternoon, more hubs fell, one in Eagle Pass, another in Las Cruces, a third buried behind a construction firm that served as a front for weapons transit. Each location revealed another piece of the system Svetkov built: backup routes, emergency communications, pre-staged vehicles, secondary identities, fallback warehouses. Layers on layers, designed to keep the network alive, even if entire sections burned. Inside the Secure Operations Center west of Austin, federal commanders watched the map collapse in real time. Each red node blinked out as another warehouse was secured, another distribution route severed, another shell company uncovered. A network that had operated invisibly for years, feeding drugs into American suburbs, sending weapons back to Mexico, moving humans through the shadows, was unraveling. Yet one truth pressed against every agent in the room. Alexei Pelman-Svetkov built this system to survive detection. He didn't need to be present. He didn't need to give orders. His machine was designed to run, even if he vanished completely. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the raids, lost in the chaos he engineered, the man himself was still moving. By the time the raids in El Paso, Laredo, Eagle Pass, and Las Cruces had ended, A new reality began spreading across the agencies involved. The warehouses were emptying, the trucks were seized. The shell companies had collapsed like hollow bones. But the shock was not in the arrests. It was in the structure that stood behind them. Alexei Pelmin-Svetkov had not assembled a criminal ring. He had constructed a system that mimicked legitimacy so perfectly that even seasoned investigators struggled to understand where the legal framework ended and the criminal one began. Over the next 72 hours, analysts dug through the servers seized from the mansion, the freight offices, and the safe houses. They found no grand manifesto, no dramatic declaration, no cinematic villain monologue. Instead, they found schedules, routes, freight optimization calculations, thermal masking algorithms, employee management charts, a hierarchy built not on loyalty or fear, but on efficiency. This was not the language of chaos, it was the language of infrastructure. For years, Americans were told to fear what lurked outside the border, what approached from distant countries, what moved through deserts and highways under cover of darkness. But this case revealed something far more unsettling. The most dangerous threat often walks into a country quietly, buys a house, files taxes, parks a luxury car in the driveway, and learns the operating rhythms of a place before reshaping its underworld in the shadows of its bureaucracy. The more investigators pieced together, the clearer the picture became. Svetkov had learned from Eastern European collapse, from Balkan gun routes, from the chaos of post-Soviet black markets. In those environments, criminals survived not by brute force, but by building redundancy. Every route had a backup. Every backup had a secondary backup. Every warehouse had a shadow warehouse. Every identity had a shadow identity. Every shell company was paired with a second that could replace it without interrupting operations. It was not loyalty that kept his empire alive. It was design. What terrified analysts most was how deeply the system had infiltrated ordinary logistics. Svetkov didn't need corrupt officials. He didn't require bribed politicians or inside men in government offices. The routes he exploited were already open. The freight corridors already existed. The inspection gaps were already there. All he needed to do was stitch them together into a single, self-reinforcing engine. To the people living near the warehouses and transport hubs, nothing had ever looked suspicious. Trucks arrived on schedule. Packages were labeled correctly. Paperwork was filed. Employees had health insurance, paychecks, and holiday hours. Everything appeared normal because it was normal, until the moment the mask dropped. Older residents across Texas reacted first. For them, the betrayal wasn't only in the drugs or the weapons or the trafficked migrants. It was in the realization that evil no longer hid in shadows. It hid in routines. It hid in the rhythm of delivery trucks. It hid in freight corridors they'd driven past for years without noticing. The threat didn't knock on the door. It moved in quietly, laughed politely, waved from a manicured lawn, and built an empire beneath their feet. Lawmakers promised investigations. Committees were formed, hearings scheduled. Oversight boards began rewriting protocols for freight screening, trucking permits, warehouse audits. But in closed-door briefings, one truth was repeated again and again until it felt like a national wound. Paper does not rebuild trust. Policy does not erase the shock. Regulations do not restore what was broken. The real damage was psychological. Because if one man, one immigrant with a fabricated identity and a methodical mind, could redirect the machinery of American logistics into a trafficking empire without raising alarms for almost a decade, then what other systems were already compromised? What other networks were hiding behind paperwork? What other quiet neighbors were building something the country didn't see? Investigators found evidence that Svetkov had studied not just supply chain maps, but human behavior. He understood how Americans trusted the appearance of order, how they believed that legitimacy could be measured by paperwork, how a well-maintained home, a polite demeanor, and timely tax filings could camouflage anything. He didn't hide in the dark. He hid in plain sight because he understood the psychology of invisibility. As the network collapsed, one fear crystallized among those leading the operation. They still hadn't found him. Alexei Pelmin-Svetkov had vanished before the first raid began. He left no message, no footprint, no signature beyond the silent heartbeat of an empire that had continued running even as its creator disappeared. The servers were still processing schedules hours after the raids started. The trucks still moved until agents intercepted them. The shipment algorithms still updated. The machine kept breathing without its architect. That was the true horror. They weren't dismantling a man, they were dismantling a design, and designs can be rebuilt. Across Texas, in town halls and community centers, citizens asked the same question again and again. How could something this vast grow unseen? How could a trafficker become a neighbor? How could a mansion become a fortress? There were no dramatic answers, no spy thriller conspiracies, just a collection of small permissions, overlooked details, unguarded gates, unchecked shipments, and the blind comfort of routine. Corruption does not roar, it accumulates, it whispers. It stacks itself quietly, brick by brick, until one day it overtakes an entire structure. In the final briefing summarizing the operation, analysts said what many feared. Tsvetkov's system was not dependent on him. Anyone with access to his maps, his backups, his coded identities, his mirrored accounts could resurrect the network. The threat was no longer the man, the threat was the blueprint. For older Americans watching the case unfold, it felt like a shattering of an idea that borders protect, that neighborhoods are safe, that danger wears a recognizable face. But the Alexei Tsvetkov case proved a darker truth. Empires of crime don't rise in deserts or alleyways. They rise wherever vigilance sleeps. Because power is only as trustworthy as the people who watch the doors. Because evil doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it moves in next door. Sometimes it waves politely. Sometimes it hides under marble floors. And sometimes it builds an empire so quietly that by the time anyone notices, it is already part of the landscape. Empires do not fall in daylight. They fall in silence. And silence is a choice. Choose to stay awake.